This is James L. Haley, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Hawk,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
James L. Haley.
We're closing in on 300 episodes rapidly. Right after the first of the year, we'll be in that 300 show range. And I would really like to thank each of you for tuning in all the time. Those of you that have subscribed over at hankgarner.com, thank you. I appreciate that. It helps other people find the show when you subscribe. There's handy links over the right-hand sidebar at hankgarner.com. I'd like to thank some sponsors today for making all of these shows possible. A huge amount of time, effort, and expense go into producing the show, and it's our faithful sponsors who make all this possible and allow us to bring you 5 shows a week. I don't know many other podcasts that bring you 5 episodes a week, but we're happy to do it, and thank you to our sponsors who allow us to do that. If you would like to sponsor the show, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a handy link up in the menu bar there. Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, is available now. This is a really unique book that Nick has written. It's kind of the best of science fiction and urban fantasy, mixed with a little bit of romance. It's a really cool mashup of genres that Nick has come up with. I love this book. I think you will too. Book 1 is out now of the Essence series. It's called Septima. And Nick said just the other day that book 2 and 3 are coming very quickly. This is some really, really innovative writing. I think you're going to love it. Go ahead and grab book 1, Septima, now, and be ready for books 2 and 3, which are coming out in rapid succession in 2018. Nick Breaker, Essence, book 1, Septima. Also, The Chronicles of Mirestone is a new collection. If you are like me and love anthologies where you get to sample the work of a lot of different authors, you're going to love this one. If you're also a fan of fantasy, like I am, you're going to love this one. 200 years ago, the dwarven clans and the elvish houses of Mirestone were at peace. The king of the dwarves, in a selfish and greedy move, used his wizards to expand their mountain empire, raising new peaks from the forest floors of their elven neighbors. War and hatred ensue. 6 talented authors lend their voices to a tale of destruction, mistrust, and hope. It's The Chronicles of Mirestone. It's a brand new release. Go pick it up. We're going to hear from some more sponsors later on in the show, and as always, don't forget to stay tuned at the end of the show for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute. Hey guys, what's up? It's Josh. I'm here with Chuck and Scott. We're going to go through another Keystroke Medium Minute. And today we're going to be talking about writing sprints and the benefits and advantages you can get through writing sprints instead of just sitting down in your computer and forcing yourself to pound on the keys for an hour. Scott kind of came to this idea. He brought it to me several years ago, and it's kind of gone through different interpretations. And when we talk about writing sprints, Scott, you started out doing 15-minute writing sprints, but I think a lot of people will say start with a 5-minute writing sprint, take a break, come back and do 5-minute, and then kind of increase your time as you go. And we've seen that you kind of up your priority where okay, I'm going to write for 5 minutes, and so you stare at the screen and you type for 5 minutes, and then you can kind of build without distractions, no internet or phone or games or anything like that. So let's talk about the different types that we do. Chuck, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. For years and years and years, I was one of those who just sat down and forced myself to write until my fingers hurt and I couldn't think anymore. And then it was probably back when I started getting into KDP, I heard about the whole sprinting method. And I find it to be very useful. I think that giving yourself those little mental breaks in between the writing sprints actually makes you more productive. I think that's the whole point of the Pomodoro method that this grew out of. And for people who don't know, really all this means is you sit down, you write for say 20 minutes, and then you take a 10-minute break. And then after that break, you write for 20 more minutes. You take another 10-minute break, and it just gives you those it breaks up your writing time. Now, that doesn't mean you immediately have to start doing 20 minutes. You can start out at 5. You can start out wherever your skill and energy level wants you to start out. But if you're someone who gets fatigued at the keyboard pretty quickly, I highly recommend giving this a shot. I found it to be very useful.
So the writing sprints, a lot of people use them to track their word count for each sprint. I did that for a while. I was like, today I got 500 words in 25 minutes, and tomorrow I need to get 520, or else I'm a loser because I'm not improving. So people like that. I think the big thing is that everybody gets stuck, and this method teaches us a way to step back, catch your breath, and then go again. So you can start in one way you might start is just write naturally, and when you feel like you're getting kind of sluggish, get up, walk around, and then go back to it, and then figure out what is the best length of a writing sprint. There's some science that says around 25 minutes is about what most people have in their brains for concentration lengths. The other thing, go ahead.
I was going to say, and definitely check and try different lengths of time, because I've done several, and 15 minutes is pretty good, and 20 minutes is pretty good. Sometimes if you do like a 5-minute sprint, sometimes I don't feel like I get any, that's not enough. And if you do like a half an hour for my 5-minute sprint, by the time you get to say 25 minutes or 40 minutes, you're ready to be done, and it's hard to push through. So you got to find what works best for your
right. And so I have 2 small caveats with this. So my warnings would be, if you get to your 25 minutes and you are just killing it, don't stop. Just keep going. That's number one. Don't feel you have to take a break. You might have a few more minutes in you. You might just keep going. If the muse is screaming at you, go with it. The other thing is when you take your break, I would recommend doing something kind of in the classroom of silence, where you maybe walk, you stretch. Don't go do something to occupy your mind. The idea here is you're catching your breath. The idea here is not to go get distracted. So that would be my main piece of advice on that technique.
Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to bring you a show with James L. Haley. His brand new book is called A Darker Sea, and it's the follow-up to his previous book, The Shores of Tripoli, some of the very best tall sail, swashbuckling adventures of the American Navy sort. I'm really excited to talk to you, Mr. Haley. Thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm so glad you called.
I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, my heavens. Well, I'm one of the few people, I don't know about few, I've wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid, and I actually did it. Maybe I was writing little stories, when I was 6 or 7, maybe. I started actually submitting stuff for publication when I was about 15. Sold my first magazine article to American Heritage when I was 19, and finished my first book when I was 22. That's not a matter of being brilliant, it's just a matter of kicking the door until they let you in. Yeah.
A lot of people maybe don't understand that they want to be a writer, as a profession.
Right.
But it's not uncommon for writers to have those ideas early on. What is interesting, and that you are sort of uncommon, is that you started, working on the profession in your teenage years. What sorts of things were you writing early on?
Oh, me. I've always been a helpless sort of animal person. And I remember I wanted to do a book about different famous animals, like Three Toes, who was a famous wolf in the Dakotas, or the man-eating lions at Tsavo in the 1890s, or Jumbo the elephant. In fact, I kind of stayed with that, and the very first article that I published when I was 19 was a biography of Jumbo, the circus elephant for American Heritage. And it took me a few decades, but I finally did a novel about the Tsavo lions for Bantam that came out about maybe in the late 80s or early 90s. So, it can take me a while, but I can be persistent.
And persistence is the key. Just,
Well, I never throw anything away. I mean, if I start a story, at whatever age, that, that's not quite going to work, it never gets thrown away. I throw away nothing. I don't like paying for the same real estate twice.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes you save them to use it for parts later, and sometimes and sometimes just that missing piece comes to you at another time, and I know why that thing didn't work now, and it's a whole lot better than starting from scratch.
I feel so much less like a freak now. I'm so glad you've told me all this.
Well, we're a strange bunch that talk to the voices in our head, and but that's okay. This is a safe place for those people, for sure.
Good. Well, we're going to have a fun chat.
That's right. What was that first novel that you published at? Would you say 22 or so?
Oh, well, it was a history book. It wasn't a novel.
Okay.
It was a history of the last of the Comanche Indian Wars. It's called the Red River War. The book was called the Buffalo War, and it was a lucky strike in the market because it was the last of the major American Indian Wars that had never had a book written about it. It was in all the quarterlies and all the encyclopedias, but there was no book about it. And I remember I was taking a Western history course from Dr. Elliott West at UT in Arlington. He later went on to University of Arkansas and won his Parkman Prize and became president of the Western History Association and all that. And I told him about this, and I was afraid he was going to laugh me out of the history department. But he gave me 6 hours of independent study credit so he could look over my shoulder and made sure that I learned how to do research. And the book came out in 1976, which tells you something about I'm no spring chicken. But it's still in print, so I did something right.
Absolutely. Where did you grow up?
Oh, I'm so sorry you asked. I do a lot of Texas history, and everywhere I go talk to a little chapter of the Daughters of the Republic, one of them will come up to me and say, "Where are you from?" And I say, "I live in Austin." She says, "No, where are you from?" I grew up in Fort Worth. "No, where were you born?" Tulsa. Well, I don't understand. Who do you think you are writing Texas history when you weren't even born here? And then they asked me about my family. And my mother was adopted from a Cherokee Indian family, so I've never even known my natural grandparents on that side. And my father's people were all either drunk or crazy, and I was never allowed to be around them. And as one sympathetic daughter said, "Well, no wonder you're so fascinated by history. You don't have any."
Well,
so I grew up in Fort Worth.
That's one way of looking at it.
I moved to Austin to go to law school many years ago, and I'm one of those many people who moved here to go to school and never left.
And never left. Oh man, Texas history is an interesting thing, and it's an interesting topic that people that are passionate about it are really passionate about it.
Oh, you have no idea.
Oh well, I'm from Mississippi, and we're not exactly the same, but there are characters that can tell you things about the Civil War era and pre-Civil War, and that will just turn your head inside out. Go ahead. No, I was just saying that sometimes it's kind of a Southern thing, although Texas is not exactly Southern per se. But I think there's some common threads
Texas
there.
Is so big. I'll correct you. Texas is so big that the eastern half of it is Southern. It's the western part that's Western. James Michener said once that in all of his research, he only knew of 2 states where the ambient street-level people were just nuts about their history. One was Virginia, and the other was Texas. And he wasn't quite sure who to give the edge to, but he kind of thought maybe Texas. And
I'm going to hedge my bets on Texas.
Well, have you got time for a little story?
Absolutely.
Let's see. I did a book called Passionate Nation about 10 years ago. It was a big 650-page, one-volume history of the state. And I found in there, of course, Buford Jester, who was governor after World War II, is the only Texas governor to die in office. And everybody knows, it's common knowledge, that he died on a train in the arms of his mistress. But I couldn't get anybody to go on the record for it or give me a footnote, and I had to leave it out of the book. Well, the book came out, and I was doing a book talk for a book club in West Austin with some many people. And there's a little old guy there, used to own an antique store here in Austin. I don't recall his name. He was about 4'10", in his 80s. He looked like a cross between Truman Capote and Quentin Crisp. I mean, the fedora, the scarf, the whole thing. And I was telling this story about I couldn't put Buford Jester's mistress in the book. And he just jumped up and he said, I knew her. We were good friends. They threw her off the train, and they wouldn't even give her bus fare home. They were so mean to her. And he took me over and showed me the house where she lived and all that. And a few months ago, I was having coffee with Jane Sibley, who's Austin's greatest arts doyen. She started the Laguna Gloria Art Museum. She was president of the symphony for 25 years. And I ghost wrote her memoirs. Well, I was telling her this, and she said, well, I knew her too. What was her name? Oh, hell. Her name was, and she said, what's that book that has all the words in it? And I said, her name was Dictionary? No. You look up a word, and it's all the words that are like it. And I said, Thesaurus? She said, Roger. She was Miss Roger.
That's the best thing I've heard today.
I have got this thing going that if I live to be about 130, I may actually come up with enough institutional memory in this city to actually reconstruct Buford Jester's mistress. But yeah, people remember stuff here. They do.
Yeah. It's I wonder what the deep rooted where that comes from. Is it because you're afraid that the outsiders are going to change history? Is it just a deep pride? Where do you think that deep connection to the past comes from?
That's a very good question, because we've had so much in the last couple of years about the Confederate monuments and all that stuff, keep them, tear them down, and when they were built, that a fear of having somebody revise your history, I can see how one might think that. But I don't think that's it. I think Texans are just so aware of what a special history they have. By the way, I found the very same thing in New England when Shores of Tripoli came out a year ago. Putnam sent me on a book tour up the Middle Atlantic, which is quite something, because book tours don't happen anymore unless you're, like Stephen King or something. And I found a lot of that avidity among people in Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, that whole Middle Atlantic. Boy, they are really proud of that maritime heritage. In fact, I was doing a book talk in the throbbing metropolis of Pawcatuck, Connecticut. It's right on the border of Rhode Island. And I was in a brew pub, and it was November, and it was very cold. There was no heat in this 150-year-old warehouse building. But they gave me a glass of beer, which was great. And I was giving this talk, and people were constantly interrupting me with, but wait a minute, that's not actually what happened. I'd say, yes, I know, it's a novel. And there's places where a novelist has to pull rank. But they were extremely knowledgeable about that sailing life 200 years ago. So I know it's not just unique to Texas, because I found the same thing in New England.
Well, I guess it's these places where generations of people tend to live together. Several, in the early days of my marriage to my wife, we did some traveling around, and we lived in Colorado for a couple of years, and we lived in Colorado Springs, where there are 5 different military bases in the town, and nobody is from there. Everybody has come from somewhere else. So everything seems to be very superficial.
Yes.
All the shopping malls are brand new. There's, the county courthouse is, 50 years old as opposed to 150, where I'm from. And, there's it's this weird thing where when people are from somewhere and they have roots and there's multiple generations, that you get these stories that go with it. And I think that's where some of our storytelling, our regional storytelling comes from, maybe.
I suspect that you're right. There's the continuity going for it, and I also think that maybe if they have a consciousness that their way of life is a very unique part of Americana, like New England seafarers or Texas ranchers, or if you have that continuity and a consciousness that you're in kind of a special place and time. I think you're right.
Yeah. So as a young man of 22 writing, Western history and American, Native American history, that's not a subject that a lot of young men tackle. Did you know that was kind of deep water for, a fresh out of college young man to be trodden?
Not particularly. I mean, I happened across that, that hole in the literature because nobody had ever written a book about the Red River Indian War. But one thing that did occur to me is that for a young writer starting out, history is a terrific way to begin, because to start off writing fiction, and this is this is before word processing. This is back when publishing houses still had readers,
Right.
and you would throw manuscripts literally over the transom and get someone to read your first effort. But reading fiction, having it judged by editors can be very subjective. It could be brilliant, but your novel might go to the one editor in the house who hates it. If you want to write political science or philosophy or economics, you have to have a PhD after your name. But one of the things I discovered about history is that if you know it and you say something new and you write it well, you can get it published, and people don't really care if you have a PhD or not. And that's I just lucked into it, that I began writing my first 3 books were nonfiction. And then my editor at Doubleday, I did all 3 books with Doubleday, Jim Minnick, he published their Western series. They did 14 a year of Western, genre Westerns, the Double D, like a brand, Double D from Doubleday. Isn't that clever? Anyway, he published these things, and he called me one day. He said, you're a pretty good writer, and your books have done well for us, and I think you can write a novel. And so I'm going to give you a contract for one of our Westerns, so you just go off and learn how to write a novel. Listen, that does not happen anymore.
No, not at all.
That does not happen anymore. And, oh boy, I had no idea. Writing fiction is just a different skill set. And David Lindsay, who wrote the Stu Hayden mysteries for Doubleday, was a friend of mine. And I stopped him one day after he went to my church. And I said, David, how do you do it? I'm dying here. I don't know how to write a novel. What do I do? Well, Jim, I don't write my novels. My characters write my novels for me. I thought, oh, thanks so much. That is so helpful.
How pretentious are you?
Yeah. And he said, no, really. Know your characters, but you just get out of the way and let them go at it. Think of actors doing improv. You just channel what they're doing and just try it. And I did, and oh my gosh, I got it 10 pages later, and it was like lightning had struck. And that's when I learned how to write fiction. You let the characters do it. So he wasn't being pretentious or clever with me. He was actually giving me the best advice I ever had.
Wow. So, from approaching fiction as a nonfiction history writer, and of the advice was write down what the characters are doing. But where did the characters come from?
Now that is where the artist can sort of impose himself and say, okay, these are the circumstances I want, because you need to cast your characters like you would cast a play. If you remember Orson Welles and his wine commercials, I cast my parties like I cast a play. You need good ones and bad ones and foils and counterfoils and all this. And in writing historical fiction, well, for instance, in the Putnam Navy series, I settled on my main character coming from Litchfield, Connecticut, and his best buddy and sidekick, Sam, is from South Carolina. So as they bond as 14-year-old midshipmen, they've got some cultural gaps to overcome. And, of course, the second book that just came out, A Darker Sea, is in the War of 1812. I'm hip deep in the third one. Well, they're going to be growing apart over time. And then by the time we get to book 6, they're going to be white-haired old Commodores fighting each other to the death in the Civil War, because one is from Connecticut and one is from South Carolina. So this whole slavery subplot that goes through the entire series, Litchfield was the center of the Congregationalist religion. It had the United States' first law school, the Reeve Law School, which is still there. It's a historic monument. And one of its students, when my character was there, actually was, in real history, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Lyman Beecher, the great abolitionist Congregationalist, moved to Litchfield in 1810. See, today Litchfield is like the number 208 largest city in Connecticut. Back then it was number 4. It was the intellectual and financial capital of the state. And it was really the place to be. It had the finest finishing school for girls, Sarah Pierce's School for Girls, in the East. And girls went there from all over the country. And so they had socials from time to time so that these eligible rich young girls could meet the students at Tapping Reeves Law School, and so on. So Litchfield, that took a lot of research to find a good fuse box of a place for my characters to come from. So, yeah, I had to be the one to come up with the characters, and then the characters have really done a lot of the writing of the stories for me. That was a short question and a very long answer. I apologize.
That's what I love. I love when you just take off and give it your own flavor there, for sure. So before you got to the Putnam series that you're writing now, you've been kind of alternating history and fiction off and on for a while, haven't you?
Yes and no. I did the Western, and then I did the adventure novel for Bantam about the Tsavo lions. And that was very interesting because I, in my young and pretentious days, I saw the whole Tsavo man-eater thing as, virgin Africa fighting off the colonial age with the only weapon. It was kind of like Moby Dick on the Dark Continent, okay? And then when my agent read it, he said, nah, give me a big man-eating lion scene, the first 5 pages. So they were thinking, Jaws in the jungle. And when when you read that book, it's so fun to tease out, okay, here's the parts I wrote for me, and here's the parts I wrote for that. It's not a very even book. There are parts of it that I wouldn't trade for anything I've ever written. I really got to explore a narrative voice in that book that I haven't really been able to do since in any other book. But yeah, the movie rights sold to Disney, so that was a big pump to the ego. Disney ultimately threw in their cards when Paramount did The Ghost in the Darkness. Studios play chicken. There wasn't one India movie, there were 3. There wasn't one OK Corral movie, there were 4, right? But they just decided not to hang in and compete with the Val Kilmer movie, so that was the end of that. And then I did...
Well, that stinks.
Oh, it's happened to every writer right now.
Right.
Life didn't aim that at me particularly.
Right.
And then I did a modern well, actually also an animal-based story called Final Refuge that came out in the early 90s. And on the surface, it was about running a zoo. But underneath, it was really about the black market in endangered species and products and so on. And it came out, and all of my reputation was in history, so it didn't sell well out of the catalog. And the publisher cut it loose. They printed enough to cover the pre-sale, and then, oops, we'll do better next time. And then I got my first New York Times review. What a wonderful book. And it got a really nice review in Wall Street Journal. What a wonderful book. And my editor called me and said, boy, we really messed up. We're so sorry. We didn't know what we had. So we're going to go back and redo it. Well, that never happened. But when you publish a real failure as a novel, your next publisher doesn't want to know if you were screwed over. They want to know how many it sold, not why it didn't. And so that washed me up as a novelist, and I went back to doing history until the Putnam series came along. And that was just a godsend. My agent, Jim Hornfisher, who lives here in Austin. By the way, so many writers, especially young writers, think they need to have an agent in New York. No, you don't. You really don't. As long as they've got contacts through the industry, I tell you what, I wouldn't trade my agent for anything. Anyway, he was in New York running his trot line, and he was chatting with this legendary editor at G.P. Putnam Sons, Nita Talblib. I mean, she had edited Danielle Steele. She'd edited Dean Koontz. She'd edited nonfiction. She did Stephen Hawking. And he said, well, what are you doing for next year? Can we get together with anything? And she said, well, we're kind of thinking about a tall ship adventure series like the Hornblower books and the Aubrey Maturin books, the Master and Commander books. But we're kind of holding back because we're not really sure the American Navy was doing anything between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And he said, hang on, I might have somebody. Well, I got home from work that day, and I had an email from my agent saying, call me, opportunity knocks. So I did. Well, opportunity does not knock very often, so I grabbed him by the belt and yanked him inside. And 48 hours later, I sent off a bullet point outline for these 6 interlocking stories. My best buddies from Connecticut and South Carolina bond in the Barbary Pirate War, the War of 1812, and they grow apart over slavery, and they wind up fighting each other in the Civil War. And Nita said, really? Send me his books. And so I'd written the Doubleday Western, I'd done the Lions of Savo, both of which are kind of artsy-fartsy. I was really worried that she wouldn't like them. And I was in Buffalo giving Jack London lectures because I'd written a biography of Jack London. And every time I would, go speak somewhere, I'd run back to my bed and breakfast and check my email to see if she'd read it. Well, she liked it, and they invited the submission. That was when I found out that she had also edited Pat Conroy. Ah. And she understood novel as art. So I can't say long story short, but long story shorter, I got a contract to do the first 3. And the first one came out a year ago. It's in its 3rd printing. Second one came out. I haven't seen any figures yet. It's been out for a week. But the reviews have just been stunning. I mean, Shores of Tripoli.
The books are stunning.
Oh, well, bless your heart. I appreciate that. I know I've been getting, when all I was doing was history, somebody would find my website and my email maybe one every 2 or 3 months and say, I really like your books. And since Shores of Tripoli, I've been getting the nicest emails from people, well, mostly nice emails. And I got one from a guy last week, said, I found Shores of Tripoli in the airport in San Francisco. And I bought it because I thought it was nonfiction. I don't read novels. I don't enjoy novels. And I got on the plane, and it was a novel, and I thought, dadgummit, and I was really hacked off. But I'm not now. I couldn't put it down. Went on and told me how, much he loved the book. That really makes it's kind of like those old Frank Capra did this 1940 series called Why We Fight. propaganda films trying to get us into World War II. And I get emails like that, and it's why I fight, you know. It's my Navy novels are different because the tradition of the genre is that about 70 to 80% of the actual word length is pulling lines and raising sails and, you know, nautical stuff. And nobody gets that anymore. And one person in 1,000 gets it. I've talked to a couple of them. But most people, it's like reading Tom Clancy. Well, no, I don't understand what's going on, but it's just so much fun to read. Well, we decided to dial back on the nautical aspect. I mean, there's still lots of action. You know, Nita, and then when she left the company, Christine Pepe, who actually edited the first book, they said they'd never been sent to a dictionary so often to look up nautical stuff. So I know there's a certain quotient of it in there. But we replaced a lot of the, jargon with social history and political history. Because to me, historical literacy in this country is just abysmal. You know, you put out a survey, what American president ordered atomic bombs dropped on an enemy? 20% of them said Ronald Reagan. You know, people are just butt ignorant about our history. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this Navy series, and I'll give them lots of action, and I'll give them a good time, but by God, you know, by the time they're done, they're going to know some history. And so we're kind of different. I was tickled to death when Wall Street Journal reviewed Shores of Tripoli and said effectively, you know, at last, here's an American Patrick O'Brien. Well, that looks great on the cover of A Darker Sea, but I didn't really want to be that Patrick O'Brien. You know, his books are wonderful, but ours are different.
Hey, authors, you need an author platform. We have talked about this over and over again. You need to have a way to communicate with your readers, and Third Scribe is there to help you do that. They are committed to authors and to readers and connecting the two of them together. You know, there's been a lot of talk lately about some changes going on over at Goodreads and the way that they're handling some of their promotions and book giveaways and going to be charging authors a great amount of money for a service that used to be free. You know, Third Scribe offers a great alternative to that. It's a great place to gather readers where you can talk about the books that you love, and it's a great place for authors to showcase their work and to connect with those readers. ThirdScribe.com is built for readers and writers. It's all about books, and that's all it's about. Go check them out today at ThirdScribe.com. Also, thanks to our good friend Daniel Arthur Smith and Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 is out now. I have a feeling there's going to be a new episode out any day now. You're going to love this series if you like the old pulp magazines. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned expertly grabs that old feeling that you used to get from reading pulp and comic magazines. Go pick it up today. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. It's my favorite monthly publication. Also, I'd like to thank the Future Chronicles. These are the very cutting-edge collections of science fiction and fantasy. If you want to know where the writers of tomorrow are coming from, they're coming from the Future Chronicles. There's a link over in the right-hand sidebar where you can go collect these amazing collections of stories of the very best speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. Thank you to the Future Chronicles. Our friend Terry R. Hill has two amazing brand new books out, 2 months with Harvey and Joseph of Bethlehem. As Terry was finishing the book Joseph of Bethlehem, which is an amazing book all about the forgotten hero of the Christmas story, and that's Joseph. This is full of great historical research and also a story that will grab you by the heart. Joseph of Bethlehem is the perfect book for this time of year. But when Terry was finishing that book, he and his family were hit by Hurricane Harvey. And for the next 2 months, his community dealt with the fallout and aftermath of this massive storm. And sadly, there are a lot of people in the Houston area where Terry lives that are still dealing with the fallout of Hurricane Harvey. This amazing book is his on-the-ground reporting of what happened during and after Hurricane Harvey. Some amazing pictures told through the lens of social media as the event was unfolding. And the proceeds of this book are going to folks still dealing with Hurricane Harvey. 2 Months with Harvey and Joseph of Bethlehem. Go pick them up both from Terry R. Hill, and you can get a signed copy of each of those at terryrhill.net. Now back to the show. Yeah. You mentioned Tom Clancy and the fun aspect mixed in with technical details, and I kind of drew that conclusion or that comparison when I was reading Shores of Tripoli, that it felt in the same way that Clancy could drop some serious technical stuff in there and give you just enough information that you kind of understood what was going on, but kept the action going and kept you invested in the characters. That
he
everything
was a master at that.
Exactly, and you operate in very similarly in with the nautical stuff, which I know nothing about, but I got enough. That I could kind of taste the salt on my face a little bit.
Bless your heart.
There's a
danger when you write fiction of telling a reader too much, because novels are art. Each piece of art has to hit everyone who sees it or reads it differently, and so you've got to let the reader use their imagination. You've got to let their mind's eye fill in something so that it will become real to them. And if you tell them too much detail, you deny them that participation. And that, to me, is one of the very, very hardest things about writing fiction, is to be looking through the big end of the telescope and knowing that the person who reads it, all they know is what you tell them. And I'm saying all the things I could tell them, but I don't. And that, to me, it's a very, very difficult balance to get right. That's one of the hardest things as a writer that I've had to come to grips with.
We talked earlier about our regional histories and why it seems like some parts of the country are more invested maybe than others. But as a nation, we have lost certain parts of our history kind of altogether. Maybe it's the way we cram American history in school and we have to skip over so much. I'm not sure what it is, but I knew almost nothing about our early American naval history. Why do you think that? And that's why these books are so important to me, is because they really filled in some gaps for me. But why do you think we don't know anything about that period of history?
Well, for one thing, ships are so different. The technology has come so far that, for instance, we think of wooden sailing ships as being kind of dinky. And yet, if you look at one of our frigates, and when I go talk to groups, I've got a PowerPoint, and I show University of Texas Memorial Football Stadium, which shows how you can put 102,000 people in there. If you took the Constitution and you plopped it down in Memorial Stadium, it would pass from beyond one goal line to beyond the other goal line.
That is
They had
insane.
a crew of 450, and the masts are over 200 feet tall. So if you took the elevator to the upper deck of the football stadium, you would still be looking up at the Royals and the Sky Seals.
Wow.
They were enormous. They were state-of-the-art war machinery at that time. But now that we've got we've passed steam engines, now we've got nuclear ships and stealth ships, and all that. That technology is so long ago that we sort of leave it behind with the knee breeches and the powdered wigs. And yet it's a fascinating story, because at the time we declared war in 1812 on England for stealing our sailors, they had, and the real war horse of anyone's fleet was their frigates, and the British had 145, we had 6.
Wow.
They had the big capital ships, the battleships of that day were the ships of the line. They had 120. We didn't have any. and yet we're going to go to war with these people. And there was a very smart naval architect named Joshua Humphreys who said, well, what we've got to do is design frigates that will totally outgun anything in their class, but they're fast enough to outrun anything they can outshoot. So they could run away from the ships of the line. And by the end of the War of 1812, the British Admiralty had issued orders, do not engage American frigates unless you have a 2-to-1 advantage or better. Our ships were that good.
Well, that's kind of the American experience, or early American experience especially, is if we couldn't outshoot you, we could outrun you, and we really brought this kind of idea of guerrilla warfare, to
the revolution. We sure did.
To the revolution,
yeah.
And it sounds like we kind of did the same thing on the high seas.
That's exactly what we did. In fact, there's a little bit of dialogue in Darker Sea exactly on that point.
So fun.
That's exactly
so
what
fun.
we did.
When
Are you still there?
Because,
I think I'm going to
yes,
okay.
I'm still here. I was thinking. I'm sorry. When you're kind of gearing up and preparing to write a series like this, because a lot of the history that you've written is Western history and Texas history and not on the water. How do you start immersing yourself in this world? Because the best fiction comes from not just writing down a series of facts that you're going to regurgitate, but immersing yourself in it so that when you're writing, it comes naturally and it flows, and you're reporting on what you know of the scene and not just making sure that you get certain aspects out.
That's a very good question. That is such a good question. I wrote very little and did almost nothing but read for about a year.
Yeah, I bet. I bet it shows.
The Navy, the people around the characters that I wanted to build. For instance, there was a very famous officer in the American Revolution, Israel Putnam, from Connecticut, who actually was the guy who introduced Vermont russet apples into Connecticut. And Bliven, my main character, grows up on a farm with an apple orchard. And so I read enough to be able to really root the story in that part of New England. A lot of reading about the Barbary War. It was kind of funny. When I was in New York promoting Shores of Tripoli, one of the guys at Fox News in New York, in fact, he's a host of Fox and Friends, Brian Kilmeade, wrote a very good nonfiction history of the Barbary Pirate War, and he found out I did this novel, and he wanted me to be on a show, not the television Fox and Friends. He does that show for an hour, and then he runs down the hall to do his radio show, which is Kilmeade and Friends. And that was it was interesting to sort of compare notes with someone else who was steeped like a tea bag in that history, right? But yeah, I did hardly anything but read for about a year and just let the story form in my mind. That's the hardest thing, is realizing I can't make a novel happen. I mean, I cannot be Hemingway and sit there and strain for a perfect sentence. I can be more like Steinbeck and just sit back and have a sip of scotch, and let a story happen. I'm one of these guys that I'm more muse dependent when it comes to fiction. And gosh, it's scary when she's on vacation. When I sit there and nothing happens. I don't know if I should admit this, but I came up on the deadline for Darker Sea, and I didn't know how to finish it. And, the muse wasn't answering the phone. And, when I finally found her walking in a park somewhere, I did the last 50 pages in 2 days, and I thought, this cannot be any good. This can't be any good. And everybody loved it. Everybody has loved it, and the reviews have just been amazing. Now I realize how people like Stephen King can be so prolific. A book a year under your own name and 2 books a year under other people's names, and they just rip it right out. Because they don't do what I was doing, which is sitting there suffering like, oh, God, should this be a comma or a semicolon? I need a better word than this. You don't worry about it. You just, you do it and you fix it later. you know. So I finally, David Lindsay, if you're listening, I finally learned how to write a novel.
Well, you know, you talked earlier about, working and writing pre-word processor. And, that's a great thing now. You can leave yourself little notes in there and just keep going and come back to it.
Oh, yeah. I moved to a new apartment about 6 weeks ago. I found boxes of carbon paper.
Oh, wow.
I'll bet there are people out there who don't even know what carbon paper is.
I'm sure. I remember, typing class in school and going to the next period class, and your fingers are all blue from loading carbon paper in the
That's
typewriter.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh yeah. God bless word processing, I tell you.
Yeah, that just flew right over half our audience's head, I'm sure. But that's okay. That's okay.
Well, I go to writers' conferences, and these millennials will tell me about some incredible piece of software that they're developing and what it'll do, and I just look at them and say, well, that's very interesting. I'll be sure and pass that along to the monks who copy my manuscripts. And they have no idea what I'm talking about.
Right. They're like, gosh, that guy's weird.
No, he's just old.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. So you said that Putnam had the idea for this, but didn't know if there was some history there.
Right.
How long did you guys foresee this taking? And you said you took a year to really study. Did they were they okay with it? This is going to take time to get up to speed, and we're going to expect a book maybe in a couple of years.
Yes and no, because I signed up. A series, they want a book a year. And I had to start writing even while I was still learning. And there are a couple of mistakes that got through in Shores of Tripoli. And believe me, these nautical devotees who read all the different series, and there's like 6 different Navy series ongoing, and they've read all the Hornblower books twice and all the Master and Commander books 3 times. If you get so much as a knot wrong, they come for you. I mean, they have no patience for mistakes, and there's a couple that got through there because I had a vision in my mind how I wanted a scene to work, and so I sketched it out, but I didn't go back and proofread it carefully enough to weed out, the wrong knot or whatever, it was. So I think the first one was about 6 months late. I think they originally envisioned a spring publication, and we had to wait for fall. And I got the second one in right under the wire. It was in on time, but just barely. And now that I know what I'm doing, they'll be coming out one a year. But that first one was rough, trying to learn the history. And oh man, I've got so many books on sailing ships. You wouldn't believe the nautical shelf that I've got now.
Well, I can imagine that the amount of world building has to be enormous. It's almost like say a fantasy author who is who's constructing a world out of whole cloth. Which you kind of are, because the audience is mostly ignorant, not as a slight, but we just are ignorant of that time. The only difference is that there are a handful of people out there that are actually checking the details, where fantasy authors are not, because you're creating something out of whole cloth, except that there are actual facts back there.
Yeah, although, when I started this series, I made a decision. There's all different ways to write historical fiction. I mean, you can tell your story and kind of put costumes on people, and that'll get you to Braveheart. Interesting movie, nothing much in there really happened.
Exactly.
And yet that movie was powerful enough, and the response to it was powerful enough to almost single-handedly reignite the Scottish independence movement. Even though the movie, Scottish warriors hadn't worn blue war paint in like 600 years, but, never mind. Or you can follow the history so faithfully and just kind of maybe make up some dialogue. And that's not very interesting. But I said, okay, what we need to do is steer these stories just as close to actual facts as good storytelling in an exciting story will bear. And so I wound up, like in the new book, in A Darker Sea, I spent a couple of days researching pumpkin pie because I was writing, saying that it's New England, they're eating pumpkin pie. Wait a minute. What makes you think that the pumpkin pie 200 years ago was like the pumpkin pie today?
Oh, no. The pumpkin pie conundrum.
And sure enough, pumpkin pie back then was you would mix up a custard of eggs and cream and spices, and you would pour it inside a whole pumpkin and cook the pumpkin. And then you would cut big wedges out of the pumpkin and scrape some of the meat out along with the custard. And that fashion just began to change right about the beginning of the 19th century. So I not only got to have pumpkin pie, but I got to go on this little riff about what is this? Well, that's the new pumpkin pie. Try it. You'll like it. Or another place, I had my main character casually writing with a pencil, and I thought, wait a minute. How do I know they had pencils back then? Well, it turned out that the first American pencils were manufactured in Massachusetts in 1812. Oh, you talk about blind luck. So I got to go off on a little pencil riff in there, but it's all accurate. In Shores of Tripoli, I had the devil of a time. I needed to know where is the Palazzo Sessa in Naples, which is where Lord Nelson had his trysting with Lady Hamilton, and I couldn't find it. I mean, there's famous. There's a Laurence Olivier, Vivien Leigh movie, That Hamilton Woman, about Lord Nelson and his mistress. Well, it turns out that the Palazzo Sessa is still there. Now, it used to be on this promontory that juts out into the Bay of Naples, and it's very romantic. But Naples, like New York and Honolulu and many other harbor towns, the waterfront has extended out into the harbor over time until that promontory is now a big hill downtown. And the Palazzo Sessa is still there, but it's surrounded by the city. And today it is the Neapolitan synagogue, of all things. But yeah, there's a lot of research that went behind the story for these things. But to me, that's just things that I don't have to make up, and B, I love it that people can research these locations, whether it's Alexandria or Derna or Gibraltar or whatever, and go, son of a gun, that was really there.
Right.
Because truth, believe me, truth is stranger than fiction.
Oh, absolutely. I'm assuming that when you sort of initially sketched out what the series was going to be, I know you said that you had a hard time landing the second book and didn't know how it was going to end. But I'm assuming from the beginning you have some sort of overarching plan with at least some road markers. Okay, I need to hit this point and this point.
Yeah.
And so do you kind of work from a structure like that and then leave the some of the characterization to just kind of the muse of the moment to let those things be fresh? How do you lay out a project like this?
Well, you described it pretty exactly. I've got major markers of when they're going to be where, and so on, and then the actual scenes. I let the characters do it, and believe me, the characters have a lot more say in where the story goes than I do. As long as they pass these pivot points, I let them carry it. It's kind of a dangerous thing to do it. There's a famous story about Winston Churchill when he took up painting, which became his principal hobby. And he set up an easel on the seashore and put paints on his palette. And he dipped a little tiny blue brush and a little bit of blue and just made little tiny strokes up in the corner for the sky. And an artist friend of his saw him do this, and he was like, no, take a big old brush and just slop. This is how you do it. Well, the idea is if you're an artist, art happens. But if you're not an artist, a mess happens. And, ever since sort of adopting David Lindsay's mode of letting the characters, I do the narrative, yeah, but basically the characters, I'm always terrified that it's going to end up in a mess. But it hasn't yet, I don't think.
Well, that's that interesting tightrope that we walk as writers. That one day it's the kind of the constant fear that this might all just go haywire, or I might be a fraud at any moment. But tomorrow I might be brilliant. So we'll just see who shows up today.
Yeah. I remember watching an interview with Katharine Hepburn late in her life, and she was reminiscing about being in her first play. And she was looking out at the audience, and all these people saying, "Oh, look at that poet thing. She's not very good." And
that's a pretty great Hepburn.
Well, you live with that terror. You do. And that's why it's art.
Exactly. So the first book in the series is called The Shores of Tripoli. The second book, which is brand new out now, called A Darker Sea. What did these two books carry us through? Where does Shores of Tripoli begin and end, and where does Darker Sea begin and end?
Shores of Tripoli begins in 1801 with my 14-year-old midshipman going down to sea. It ends in 1805 with the first treaty. Of course, we had to go back later, like 10 years later, for the second Barbary War. We decided, well, let me put it this way. We've got 6 books to do, and we've got maybe 40 different stories that we could do. And Nita, at the beginning, saw this in a heartbeat. We could do Jean Lafitte in the Caribbean in 1818. We could do the Opium War in China in 1842. We could do the Mexican War in 1848. We could be with Perry opening Japan in 1855, with the Atlantic Fleet chasing down slave ships in the 1850s. There's all these stories. And I was in Connecticut giving this book talk, and there was an elderly lady raised her hand, and she said, "Well, I just want to know how this series ends, because, I'm getting on up there." And we decided to do these 6 beginning to end. And, the traditional genre books, the Hornblower books, when C.S. Forester wrote Beat to Quarters in 1936, he had no idea that it was going to be a series. So Horatio Hornblower is a full-blown captain. And then when it turned into another book and another book, it's this mess of prequels and sequels. Well, when C.S. Forester died and Patrick O'Brien picked up the franchise with Master and Commander, it didn't sell. And it just dribbled along. Well, let's try a second book, and he did Post Captain. But it also wasn't really intended to be a series until it just turned into one. So we're planning it out, but I'm building little nubs and stubs of future stories in these books. So for that lady in Connecticut, we're going to get to the end in another 4 years. It'll be in the Civil War. Then I'm going to go back and fill in, if I live long enough, with Jean Lafitte in Texas in 1818, or these other possible stories. He could go back with the Second Barbary War in 1815. All that. But in Book 3, The Devil in Paradise, which is going to come out this time next year, he has gone to Hawaii with the missionaries, when we sent missionaries to Hawaii.
Nice. I cannot wait. I absolutely love these books.
You're so kind.
I did not expect to love them as much as I do. I knew from what I read about them and what I saw, these are going to be really intriguing books. But they have really captured my heart and my imagination in a way that a new genre for me has not in quite some time. So I highly recommend these books.
You just made my day.
Oh, well,
let me tell you.
It's you've done a phenomenal thing, and you've made me a fan of high seas adventure like I didn't think I would. So a wonderful, wonderful feat. So I'm going to send everybody to go pick up a copy of Shores of Tripoli and A Darker Sea. Mr. Haley, if folks are not familiar with you and your work, where can they find you and kind of get up to speed on everything that you do and have done?
Well, I've got a website, which is www.jamesLhaley.com, and there's kind of a carousel of several of my previous books that they can come up to speed that way. And then, of course, both the Putnam novels are widely available. your neighborhood bookstore or online. I'm glad there are still bookstores. I tend to be old-fashioned that way.
Me and you both. Yeah,
but I do have a website that people can look at and see, sort of like I said, a carousel of the previous books. Now I am in the next week. I'm going to be getting a newer computer that will allow me to e-publish, because I do own a lot of my older books, and I know I'm missing out people who might be interested in some of those earlier books. So they're going to be launched as ebooks in the coming couple of years. Of course,
Nice.
My first obligation is to Putnam and tending to their business one a year. But as I get time, those earlier books are going to have a new birth of freedom.
Excellent. I'm so happy to hear that. Mr. Haley, will you come back next year when the third book comes out, and let's catch up again?
Anytime you call, buddy.
Excellent. Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Brian moved in closer, entering the rusty greenhouse through its eastern arch, keeping clear of the subject's line of sight. He pressed through the rose house, nothing but thorns, and into the grapery, nothing but vines. The meditation tones of the wind chimes were like fingers lipping crystal goblets. Two marble children hugged each other, swallowed by the swamp of a neglected fountain. Brian's shadow entered the palm house, the domed space at center, and the rest of him followed. Brian took aim at the figure's back and whistled. "Hands up there!" The figure waggled its shoulders a little, reaching for a weapon, maybe. "Did you hear me? Hands up! Now!" Brian circled the intruder. He took out his penlight and shone it in the man's face. Shit. Burlap and buttons. Just one of the stupid scarecrows. He thumbed his comm. "False alarm!" But Abby didn't reply. He'd lost signal. He slung his rifle back and put up his fists. He delivered a slow-motion punch to the scarecrow's head, an old potato sack with black lettering down one cheek. Its red button eyes were sewn on with plastic thread, maybe dental floss. The mouth was a bright red shoestring hot glued to the burlap. One end had shaken loose, so that the mouth drooped like a stroke victim's. Brian delivered a slow karate kick to its body, a business suit stuffed with hay. A stink rose. The guts were rotted. Only this one scarecrow had survived the storm. A couple dozen others had fallen face down in the mud of the palm house, strewn about like martyrs of some great scarecrow war. Motion caught his eye, and he frowned. A second scarecrow had survived the storm. He hadn't noticed it before, but he should have. This one wore a yellow hard hat and carried an axe. The hard hat was caked with mud, as if the scarecrow had been on the ground. Had someone righted it? Brian turned away from it, disturbed, and noticed a third scarecrow leaning against a nearby wall. This one wore a clown costume and mud-soaked rainbow hair. How the hell had he missed that one? He was an idiot. If that had been a person, they might have shot him in the head by now. He backed away from the trio of scarecrows. They reminded him of some Sunday school tableau. He was about to make his exit when a white face flew from the shadows. The hockey mask of Jason Voorhees, the machete-wielding psychopath of the Friday the 13th movies. The mask landed at Brian's feet and stared up at him. It was a dime store plastic thing, trailing a broken length of pink rubber band, with two sad hollows for eyes above an extruded nub of nose. The cheeks were pierced with little holes and bore 3 bloody streaks of war paint. Some poor scarecrow had lost its fright mask. Brian bent and picked it up, turned it in his hand, letting moonlight play across the concave interior face, creating that optical illusion where the gaze follows you. He lifted the mask, thinking of some childhood Halloween. When? Decades ago, when he'd been Jason Voorhees, stalking Sleepy Hollow, his tinfoil machete dripping Heinz 57. When did I get to be so old? People didn't appreciate the classic scares anymore, the old shock cuts and startle tricks. He made little panting horror flick sounds, ch-ch-ch, ah-ah, held the mask to his own face, and looked through its cut-out eyes. "Trick or treat," he whispered. The answer was trick. A dozen scarecrows surrounded him. A dozen more writhed up from the mud. The eyeless corpse of Ferris the gate guard shrugged a hungry pecking crow and pounced.